He thought it was just a routine traffic stop, but what happened next changed everything. Stay with us, because this story takes a turn you'll never see coming. I guarantee you won't want to miss a second of it. And if you're new here, don't forget to subscribe and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Your support means the world to us. The rain drummed steadily against the roof of Marcus's car, the rhythmic tapping blending with the soft hum of the engine. The glow of streetlights stretched out like golden streaks on the rain-slicked pavement, distorting his view as he drove through the quiet suburban road. It had been one of those exhausting days where every task felt heavier than it should have been. His mind was a foggy mess, his body aching for the peace of home. A hot cup of tea and silence. That was all he craved right now. His windshield wipers moved back and forth in a slow, hypnotic rhythm, struggling to keep up with the drizzle that had been falling for hours. Each pass of the wipers revealed more of the road ahead, but did little to ease the heaviness in his chest. He glanced at the dashboard clock. 10:42 p.m., later than usual. He sighed, shifting in his seat, trying to stay focused on the road. The distant glow of red and blue lights appeared in his rearview mirror. At first, he thought it might be an ambulance or a passing police car on its way to some emergency. But then the lights grew brighter, closer, flashing with an urgency that was all too familiar. His heart skipped, then settled into a quick, heavy thump. "Here we go again," he muttered under his breath, fingers tightening on the steering wheel. The siren let out a short burst, a single blare that signaled him to pull over. Marcus checked his speedometer, 32 miles per hour. Well within the 35 amp limit. His registration was up to date, his tail lights weren't out. There was no logical reason for him to be stopped, but logic had nothing to do with this. He'd lived this scene too many times before. He flicked on his turn signal, easing his car to the side of the road. His eyes darted to the rearview mirror, catching sight of the police car behind him. He switched off the engine and rolled down his window just enough for his voice to be heard. The damp night air seeped in, carrying with it the metallic scent of rain and wet asphalt. His pulse quickened, but his face remained calm. "Hands at 10 and 2, he whispered to himself. "Stay calm. Stay in control." His eyes remained locked on the side mirror as he watched the officer approach. The heavy crunch of boots against wet pavement echoed in the quiet night. The officer moved slowly with deliberate purpose, every step a declaration of authority. Marcus had seen it too many times before, that walk, that deliberate, slow, commanding walk. The officer stepped into the glow of Marcus's dashboard lights. Tall, broad-shouldered, his face set in an expression of practiced indifference that barely masked the hint of superiority. His rain-soaked hat dripped water onto the car door as he leaned forward. The name tag on his chest read, "Hill." "License and registration," Officer Hill barked, not even bothering with a good evening. His voice was sharp, his tone carrying the weight of command. Marcus moved slowly, keeping his hands visible as he reached for the glove compartment. "Evening, officer," he said, his voice steady but firm. "Mind telling me why I'm being stopped?" Hill's eyes narrowed as he leaned in closer, his breath fogging the cool night air. "You were driving suspiciously slow," he said, each word laced with condescension. "Like you're hiding something." Marcus felt a flash of frustration in his chest, but he forced it down. "It's raining," he said, motioning to the windshield. "I'm just being cautious." Hill smirked, the corner of his mouth curling upward in a way that sent a shiver down Marcus's spine. "Careful, huh? That's what they all say." He watched as Marcus retrieved his license and registration, handing them over without a word. Hill snatched the papers from his hand, his eyes never leaving Marcus's face. His gaze lingered for a second longer than necessary, as if daring Marcus to make a wrong move. Then, without a word, Hill turned and walked back to his cruiser. Marcus exhaled slowly, his eyes following Hill as he sat in his patrol car, fiddling with the radio. The rain grew heavier, pelting the roof with steady, sharp taps. He watched Hill glance over his shoulder, looking toward Marcus's car like he was expecting backup. Marcus gritted his teeth. He'd seen this before. He knew what was coming. Minutes passed. Then Hill returned. His walk was different this time, quicker, more forceful. He stopped at the driver's side window and shoved the documents back into Marcus's hands. His face was tight with irritation. "Step out of the vehicle," Hill ordered, his eyes cold as stone. Marcus frowned, his breath fogging in the cold air. "For what reason, officer? I haven't done anything wrong." Hill's expression hardened, his lips pressing into a thin line. His voice dropped, colder now, sharper. "Step out of the vehicle." Marcus sighed, unbuckled his seatbelt, and slowly opened the door. The cold drizzle soaked into his jacket as soon as he stepped out. The chill bit through the fabric, but he kept his face calm, his movements deliberate. "Open the trunk," Hill ordered, motioning toward the back of the car. "With all due respect, officer, you need a warrant for that," Marcus replied, his voice calm but firm. Hill's eyes narrowed, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "That's where you're wrong. I can check whatever I damn well please." Marcus stood his ground. "No, you can't," he replied, his tone steady but firm. But Hill was already moving, his key ring jangling as he approached the back of the car. The trunk popped open with a soft click. Marcus's heart pounded as he saw Hill's eyes lock onto the black case tucked neatly in the corner. Hill reached for it, ignoring Marcus's protests. "That's private property," Marcus said sharply, stepping forward. "You have no right." But it was too late. Hill flipped open the latches with a quick snap, lifting the lid. The air changed. Marcus watched Hill's face shift from smug confidence to something else entirely. The rainwater streaming off his hat brim fell in slow, rhythmic drops. His smirk vanished. His eyes darted over the documents, his jaw tightening with every word he read. Marcus crossed his arms, leaning against the side of the car. "Something catch your eye, officer?" he asked, his tone laced with quiet defiance. Hill didn't answer. His hands trembled as he gripped the papers. His eyes darted across the top of the first page, his name printed in bold letters beneath the header, "Notice of Termination." Beneath that, a list of complaints, incident dates, and citations for abuse of power. Hill's breathing grew heavier. He flipped to the next page, a transcript from an internal hearing. Then another page, a citizen complaint with vivid details. His face paled as he recognized the names, the dates, the incidents, things he thought had been buried. "What the hell is this?" Hill muttered, his voice hoarse with disbelief. He glanced up at Marcus, his eyes wild with panic. This is illegal. You can't have this." His voice rose in pitch. "Who gave you this? Who do you think you are?" Marcus raised an eyebrow. "The question isn't who I am, officer. The question is, why does this case exist in the first place?" Hill's face twisted in rage. "You think you're clever, huh? You think you can blackmail me with this crap?" Marcus tilted his head, his eyes calm but sharp. "This isn't blackmail, Hill. This is accountability." Hill's hands crumpled the edges of the paper. He glanced around, his eyes wild, like a caged animal searching for an exit. Then his gaze snapped back to Marcus. His eyes filled with something new. Fear. His eyes darted to the dashboard of Marcus's car. A small, red, blinking light reflected off the glass. Realization dawned on him like a crashing wave. His face twisted with rage. "You recorded this?" he barked, his voice thick with fury. "Of course," Marcus replied, his tone calm as ever. "People like you aren't known for playing fair." Hill lunged for the car, but Marcus stepped between him and the dashboard. "Touch it," Marcus said, his eyes locked on Hill's. "And you'll be adding tampering with evidence to that long list." Hill's hand hovered in the air, his chest heaving. Rain streamed down his face, but the storm in his eyes was worse. His fist shook, his face contorted with fury. "This isn't over," Hill hissed, his voice low and venomous. Marcus leaned in close, his eyes unflinching. "No," he said, his voice a quiet blade. "It's just—" Marcus sat behind the wheel of his car, his grip on the steering wheel tight as his heart continued to pound in his chest. The rain had only gotten heavier, turning the world outside into a gray, watery blur. His breaths came slow and measured, the adrenaline still coursing through his veins like an electric current. He glanced at the rearview mirror one last time, watching Officer Hill grow smaller in the distance. The man was still standing by the side of the road, soaked in rain, his face twisted in a mixture of rage and disbelief. Marcus didn't smile. He knew better. Men like Hill didn't accept defeat. They plotted. They retaliated. As he navigated the dimly lit streets, his mind raced with thoughts of what had just happened. The image of Hill's face when he saw his own termination notice was etched into Marcus's mind like a scar. He had been planning this moment for weeks, but he hadn't expected it to go down like this. The confrontation, the threats, the barely contained violence. It had all been dangerously close to spiraling out of control. But now it was done, and Marcus had something far more valuable than a moral victory. He had proof. The weight of the black case sitting on the passenger seat was almost physical. It was more than just paper and a USB drive. It was a weapon. Evidence of Hill's corruption, proof of his abuse of power, and ammunition that Marcus intended to use to bring him down. The rain tapped against the roof of the car like a ticking clock, reminding him that every second mattered now. His phone buzzed on the passenger seat, and Marcus reached over, his eyes flicking between the road and the screen. It was a message from Rachel Martinez. Just her name brought a sense of calm to his stormy mind. Rachel was an investigative journalist known for exposing corruption in city institutions. She didn't just write stories. She toppled systems. Rachel. "Still good to meet tonight?" Marcus let out a breath he didn't realize he was holding and quickly typed back a reply. Marcus. "Yeah, I have everything. It's big, Rachel. Bigger than we thought. Meet me at the spot." He hit send and placed the phone back on the seat, glancing at the glowing screen one more time. The storm outside didn't feel as heavy anymore. Rachel was his ace in the hole. If anyone could turn this evidence into something the world couldn't ignore, it was her. The drive home felt longer than usual. Every pair of headlights in his rearview mirror set his nerves on edge. Every car that followed too long felt like a threat. He knew how this worked. Hill wasn't just another cop. He had friends. People in high places. People who didn't like seeing one of their own exposed. Marcus's hands tightened on the steering wheel. If they were watching, let them watch. They'd see him do this the right way. When he finally pulled into the driveway of his small, one-story house, he sat for a moment, letting the engine hum beneath him. The rain was still falling steadily, streaking the windshield like lines of static on an old TV. The house lights were off, but the porch light buzzed softly, flickering once or twice. He reached for the case, clutching it like it held his very future inside. He took a breath, glanced around, then stepped out into the rain. By the time he reached his front door, his jacket was soaked, water dripping from his hood onto his face. He fumbled with the keys, glanced over his shoulder, and entered the house quickly. The door clicked shut, and he locked it. Deadbolt too. His heart slowly eased as he set the black case down on the kitchen table. The rain, tapping on the windows, filled the silence. The familiar hum of the refrigerator brought him back to reality. He wasn't on the street anymore. He was home. For now, he was safe. His phone buzzed again, and this time it was a call. Rachel. He swiped to answer, leaning against the wall as he pulled back his wet hood. "Hey," Marcus said, his voice calmer than he felt. "Hey," Rachel replied, her voice sharp and clear. "You good?" "Yeah, I'm good. It's done." There was a pause on the other end. He could hear her breathing as she processed the weight of those words. "You sure? No loose ends?" "No loose ends," Marcus replied, glancing at the black case on the table. "It's all here, Rachel. Everything we talked about. Files, complaints, USBs, with footage and audio. He's done. Done." Another pause. When Rachel spoke again, her tone had shifted. She was in work mode now, focused, determined. "All right," she said. "We need to move fast. Hill's not stupid. He's going to come for you, and he's going to bring friends." "I know," Marcus said quietly, "but I'm ready." "You better be," she replied, "because once this story breaks, it's going to get ugly." They agreed to meet in 30 minutes. Marcus hung up and stood there for a moment, staring at the case. The air in the house suddenly felt thicker, heavy, like the storm outside had crept in while he wasn't looking. He ran his fingers through his hair and moved to his bedroom to change out of his wet clothes. By the time he returned, he was dry but still tense. He glanced at the front door. It was still locked, deadbolt secure, but something about the silence outside didn't feel right. He reached over and flicked off the kitchen light, letting the glow from the streetlights outside fill the room with pale, gray light. He stepped toward the window, parting the curtain with 2 fingers just enough to see. A black sedan, parked across the street. The engine was off, but he knew a stakeout car when he saw one. It didn't have its lights on, and no one got in or out. His eyes narrowed, and his jaw tensed. He let the curtain fall shut, his mind already racing. They were watching. Maybe it was Hill. Maybe it was someone else. Either way, it didn't matter. He was already in too deep to turn back. The next 30 minutes felt like an eternity. Every creak in the house made his heart jump. He checked the locks twice, glancing at the black sedan through the window each time. No movement. No lights. Just the still shape of a car watching him from across the street. Then, finally, a set of headlights pulled up in front of his house. Marcus squinted through the rain-streaked window, spotting Rachel's gray hatchback. Relief washed over him. He grabbed the black case and slipped on his jacket, heart pounding, but steady now. It was time. Rachel stepped out of the car, pulling her hood up against the rain. She glanced towards the black sedan across the street, then back at Marcus's front door. She noticed it. Good. She was sharp. He opened the door and waved her in, locking it as soon as she stepped inside. She shook off the rain, her eyes narrowing as she glanced at him. "Across the street?" she asked. "Yeah," Marcus muttered. "Been there for 30 minutes. Rachel's jaw tightened. "We don't have much time then." They sat at the kitchen table. Rachel pulled a small notebook from her bag, flipping it open. Her pen moved quickly as Marcus laid out every detail, every name, every incident in the files. Her eyes widened at certain parts, her lips pressing into a tight line. "You weren't lying," she muttered. "This is bigger than Hill. This is half the department." "Yeah," Marcus said, leaning back in his chair. "I told you it was big." Rachel glanced at him. "You know what happens next, right? Hill's not going to wait for this to blow over. They're coming for you, Marcus." Marcus leaned forward, his eyes meeting hers. His voice was steady, his resolve unshakable. "Let them come," he said. "I'm done running from people like him. We're doing this tonight, Rachel. Publish it. Video, files, everything. No leaks, no warnings. We hit them all at once, and we hit them hard." Rachel's eyes flickered with something close to admiration. "All right then," she said, pulling out her phone. "Let's make some noise." The rain outside had slowed to a light drizzle. The black sedan across the street hadn't moved, but Marcus knew it would. He'd seen men like Hill before, men who thought power was a shield. But Marcus had learned something important that night. No one is untouchable. Rachel typed quickly on her phone, uploading files to a secure server. Marcus watched as the progress bar filled inch by inch. When it was done, she glanced up at him and nodded. "It's live," she said. "No turning back now." Marcus didn't blink. He just leaned back in his chair, eyes locked on the front door. "Good," he muttered. "No turning back." The early morning sun struggled to break through the thick gray clouds that lingered in the sky. The streets were still wet from the storm the night before, puddles reflecting fragments of sunlight as the city slowly woke up. Marcus sat at his kitchen table, his eyes locked on the screen of his phone. His fingers hovered over it, refreshing the page every few seconds, watching as the number of views on Rachel's article climbed higher and higher. Headline after headline appeared in the newsfeed. Officer exposed for corruption and abuse of power. Police cover-up revealed. And shocking video footage of Officer Hill released to the public. The public reaction was immediate. Comments, shares, retweets, it was everywhere. People were angry, people were furious, people wanted justice. Marcus took a slow sip from his coffee cup, the bitterness grounding him in the moment. His eyes flicked to the window, checking the street outside. It was quiet. No black sedans, no lurking figures. But that didn't mean he was safe. He knew that too well. Men like Hill didn't disappear quietly. They fought back, and they fought dirty. His phone buzzed on the table, vibrating against the wood. It was Rachel. "Hey," Marcus said as he picked up. "Hey." Rachel's voice was calm, but there was an edge of urgency underneath. "It's out there. The response is massive. People are calling for his badge. It's all over the city." "I'm seeing it," Marcus replied, leaning forward on the table. "They're not just calling for his badge, Rachel. They're calling for reform. This is bigger than him." "Yeah," Rachel agreed. There was a pause on the line, like she was weighing her next words carefully. "But listen, I'm getting calls, strange calls. People asking questions they shouldn't be asking. Someone's already trying to get ahead of it." "Who?" Marcus's eyes shifted to the window again. "Cops, detectives, anonymous numbers," Rachel said. "They're looking for you, Marcus. I think Hill's people are moving." "Let them move," Marcus muttered. "They know where I am." "Don't be stupid," Rachel snapped. "You have the upper hand right now, but that won't mean anything if they take you in. You know how this works." "I know." Marcus said quietly. I'm not going to be reckless, but I'm not hiding either. There was silence on the line, only the soft sound of Rachel breathing. Finally, she said, Just watch your back, Marcus. I'm serious. Always, Marcus replied, and the call ended with a soft click. He sat there for a moment, staring at the phone in his hand. Then, slowly, he placed it face down on the table. His eyes shifted to the black case sitting on the counter. He'd handed over most of the files to Rachel, but he still had copies. Backup copies. He wasn't stupid. He'd seen too many people put their trust in the system, only to watch that system eat them alive. The knock at his door was sharp. 3 fast, heavy thuds. Marcus didn't move right away. His eyes narrowed, his body suddenly tense. No one knocked like that unless they wanted something. He rose slowly from his chair, his feet silent on the hardwood floor as he approached the door. He glanced through the peephole and felt a rush of relief and caution at the same time. It was Officer Jackson. Marcus, it's me, Jackson called from the other side. Open up. Marcus unlocked the deadbolt, but he kept the chain in place. He cracked the door just wide enough to see Jackson's face. The older officer looked tired. His uniform was wrinkled, and the lines on his face seemed deeper than usual. His eyes darted down the street before settling back on Marcus. Everything okay? Marcus asked, his voice low and steady. Not really, Jackson replied, his eyes still scanning the street. Can I come in? We gotta talk. Marcus hesitated, glancing behind Jackson toward the street. No cars, no sedans. But that didn't mean no one was watching. He unhooked the chain and pulled the door open. Jackson stepped inside, brushing rain off his shoulders. He moved toward the kitchen like he'd done it 100 times before, but this was only his second visit. What's going on? Marcus asked as he closed the door and locked it again. Jackson leaned on the counter, his eyes serious. It's bad, he said, rubbing a hand over his face. Words spread through the department. Hill's losing it. He's calling in favors, pulling strings. Of course he is, Marcus said, crossing his arms. I knew this was coming. It's more than that, Jackson said, his voice dropping lower. He's not just calling favors, he's calling them. The guys who think they own the city, detectives, sergeants, people with pull. They're not happy, Marcus. They're calling you a threat. Marcus felt a slow heat rise in his chest. Not fear, not anger, something colder. A threat to what? Their paycheck? Their overtime? Worse, Jackson said. He tapped a finger on the counter, his eyes locked on Marcus. A threat to their control. They see you as a man with too much power. You've got the public behind you. They can't control you, and that scares them. Marcus stayed quiet for a moment, letting the words settle. What do they want, Jackson? You here to offer me a deal? Tell me to back down? Jackson shook his head slowly. No deals, Marcus. Not from me. He leaned in closer. I'm here because I know how this ends if you don't play it smart. They'll frame you, plant evidence, get you locked up and forgotten. I've seen it before. I've seen it too many times. Marcus's jaw tightened. He knew Jackson wasn't lying. He'd seen it too. You telling me to run? Marcus asked, tilting his head. Is that what this is? No, Jackson said firmly. I'm telling you to be ready. They'll come, Marcus, and they won't knock next time. They stood in silence for a moment. The sound of rain tapping against the window filled the room. Jackson glanced at the black case on the counter. Still got backups? Jackson asked, motioning toward it. Always, Marcus replied. Jackson gave a short nod, the kind of nod a man gives when he knows a fight is coming. Good. Don't trust anyone, Marcus, not even me." Marcus tilted his head, his eyes sharp. "Then why are you here?" "Because someone's gotta warn you," Jackson said, heading toward the door. "Don't answer your door unless you're ready. I won't be able to stop them next time." Jackson left and Marcus stood by the door for a long time, listening to the rain. He checked his phone again. Text from Rachel. "It's blowing up. They're panicking. Be ready." Be ready. He wasn't sure he knew how to be anything else. The day dragged on like slow-moving thunderclouds. The rain finally stopped, but the clouds stayed, looming like a warning. His phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't Rachel. It was a number he didn't recognize. He let it ring. No voicemail. It buzzed again. Same number. He let it ring again. Then came the knock at the door. Not 3 knocks, not heavy thuds. Just one soft tap. Marcus's heart kicked in his chest. He moved towards the door, but he didn't open it. Not this time. The soft knock came again. His fingers hovered over the lock. His eyes flicked to the black case. He thought of everything in that case. Every file. Every name. Every piece of evidence that could burn men like Hill to the ground. "Who is it?" Marcus called, his voice calm but sharp. Silence. He moved to the window and pulled the curtain aside just enough to see. His heart slowed. It wasn't a detective. It wasn't Hill. It was Rachel. She was standing there, hands in her pockets, eyes scanning the street. He opened the door, his body still tense. She slipped inside quickly, her face a mix of relief and caution. "They're moving, Marcus," she said, pulling off her jacket. "We've got a window, but not a big one. Hill's on the phone with his people right now. If we're doing this, it's got to be now." Marcus glanced at the black case on the counter, then at Rachel. "Then let's do it," Marcus said. His voice was steady, his eyes unflinching. "No more waiting." Rachel nodded, pulling out her phone. "All right," she said, "no more waiting." Marcus sat at the table as Rachel got to work. He didn't move, didn't blink, didn't breathe too deeply. He watched her fingers fly across the screen. He watched as the floodgates opened. The storm outside had passed. But the real storm was just beginning. The sun had barely risen, its faint glow struggling to push through the heavy gray clouds hanging low over the city. The streets were quiet, but not calm. It was the kind of silence that comes before something breaks. Inside his small living room, Marcus sat on the edge of his couch, hands clasped together, his eyes locked on the TV. Every news station had the same story on repeat. His name, his video, his evidence. Corruption exposed, Officer Hill under investigation for abuse of power. The images of Hill's face, first confident, then pale with fear, were plastered on every major network. Clips of the confrontation at the side of the road were played on a loop, his voice clear and calm as he told Hill, "No one is untouchable." The people were talking. The world was watching. But Marcus knew it wasn't over. Not even close. His phone buzzed on the coffee table, and he glanced down at it. Unknown number. He didn't answer. Another buzz, then another. Then silence. He knew who it was. It had to be them. Cops, detectives, people who had seen their world start to crumble and wanted to stop it before it was too late. Then a knock at the door. Hard, 3 sharp thuds. Not Rachel, not Jackson. This knock had weight behind it. Marcus's heart picked up speed, but his face stayed calm. He stood slowly, his eyes flicking to the black case still sitting on the kitchen counter. Backup files, insurance, evidence. He glanced at the front door, then at the window. No black sedans this time. No subtle surveillance. No shadows lurking in the distance. Whoever was at the door, they weren't hiding. Another knock, louder this time. "Marcus, open up! Police!" He stayed where he was, his breathing slow and controlled. He knew how this worked. They wanted him to panic. They wanted him to open the door, step outside, and resist. He wasn't playing their game. His phone buzzed again, this time a text. It was from Rachel. "Rachel, they're moving on you. Get out. Now." He stared at the text for a second longer than he should have. He knew she was right. They weren't going to talk. They were going to force their way in. "Marcus, last warning. Open this door or we're coming in." His eyes shifted to the hallway closet. There, tucked behind his old coats, was his bag. He'd packed it days ago, just in case. A change of clothes, cash, phone charger, another backup of the files. His fingers twitched at his sides, muscles tensed like a coiled spring. Bang! The first kick hit the door. Bang! The frame shook, splinters cracking at the edges. Bang! It wouldn't hold for long. "All right," he muttered to himself, taking one last glance around the room. He didn't have much time. He grabbed the black case off the counter, shoved it into his bag, and zipped it up tight. He pulled the strap over his shoulder and darted toward the back of the house. Another bang at the door. This time it didn't just crack, it caved. Heavy footsteps filled the front entryway. "Police! Marcus Reed, you're under arrest. Come out with your hands up." They weren't here to arrest him. He knew that. They were here to make him disappear. He reached the back door and unlocked it as quietly as possible, his heart thudding in his ears. He pressed his back against the wall, peering through the narrow crack. The backyard was empty. No cars, no men, just rain-drenched grass and the distant hum of the city. He could make it. If he moved fast, he could make it. But then he heard it. The sound of boots, crunching, wet grass being pressed down. His eyes darted to the corner of the yard and he saw him, one of them. A cop in a black raincoat, his hand on his holstered gun, his eyes scanning the backyard. Marcus's pulse surged, but his mind stayed sharp. He stepped back into the hallway, breathing slow and quiet. They were in the house now. He could hear their voices, sharp and quick. "Clear the kitchen." "Nothing here. Check the bedroom." He had seconds. No more than that. He stepped toward the closet, threw it open, and pulled down the attic hatch. The old wooden ladder creaked as it extended, but it was quiet enough. He moved with purpose, quick but steady, climbing up into the narrow crawlspace. Dust filled his lungs as he pulled himself up, sliding the ladder back up with him. Click. The hatch closed. Darkness surrounded him. He stayed low, on his stomach, breathing through his mouth. Every creak, every bang, every heavy bootstep below echoed through the floorboards. He could hear them moving. "He's not here. He's here. He wouldn't run. Check everything." He could feel them below him. Closer now. They were searching the rooms one by one. He pressed his face against the cold wood, eyes closed tight. His hand slowly reached for his phone. Rachel had to know. She had to know he was still alive. His fingers moved slowly, blindly typing out the message. "In attic. They're searching. Call Jackson." He pressed send. The phone buzzed once, confirming the message had been sent. Then he held his breath. The voices below grew louder. "Nothing in the back. Check the closet." "What about the attic?" There was a pause. Marcus's chest ached from holding his breath. "Nah. Old houses like this, those attics are sealed tight. No one's up there." A rush of relief hit him so hard he almost exhaled too loud. He clamped a hand over his mouth. His heart was a jackhammer in his chest, but he stayed perfectly still. More footsteps. More voices. "We'll check the basement." Minutes felt like hours, but finally the noise started to fade. He could hear them moving toward the front of the house. One voice spoke louder than the rest. "He's not here. Call it in. We'll get him later." They left. He heard the crunch of boots on the front porch, the roar of their engines as their cars pulled away. Marcus didn't move. Not for a long time. He lay there, every muscle stiff, every breath slow and shallow. His eyes stared into the darkness. Then his phone buzzed. One message. "Rachel. Jackson's on his way. Stay hidden." Marcus exhaled slowly, his face pressed against the wood. His fingers released their grip on the phone, letting it rest beside him. His eyes shut for a moment. Just a moment. When he opened them, he was ready. He moved slowly, silently, lowering the attic hatch just enough to peek down. Empty. No sound. No cops. Just the rain. Soft now, tapping against the windows like an old friend. He climbed down, every step slow, deliberate, no sudden moves. His eyes scanned the kitchen, the hallway, every corner. No shadows, no boots. Just him. Just the silence. He reached for his phone, his fingers moving fast. "Marcus, it's done. I'm moving." He grabbed his bag, slinging it over his shoulder. He checked the locks on the doors, knowing it didn't matter. They'd be back. He knew that now, but they wouldn't find him next time. He slipped out the back door, his feet crunching on the wet grass. No hesitation this time. He didn't stop to look for them. He just moved. Past the lawn, past the fence, into the alley behind the houses. No hesitation, no looking back. The rain had finally stopped, but the clouds were still heavy. He pulled his hood up, walking with purpose. His eyes stayed forward, sharp and steady. He could still feel them out there, watching, searching, but they wouldn't find him. Not this time. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, glanced at the screen. Rachel. They know they lost. "You won, Marcus, but be ready. It's not over." Marcus slipped the phone back into his pocket. His pace never slowed. His heart stayed steady. "I know," he muttered to himself, his breath mixing with the cool morning air. "I know." As he disappeared into the city streets, the first light of dawn finally broke through the clouds. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time in a long time, Marcus knew one thing for certain. They could chase him all they wanted. They'd never catch him. And that's where the story ends. For now, but trust me, this is far from over. If you want to see what happens next, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss a single twist. Drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. We love hearing from you. And don't forget to check out our other powerful stories. See you in the next one.